10 men entered the wilderness, rifles in hand, accompanied by dogs, and driven by an unshakable certainty that they would drag one man back in chains. Not a single one returned. To truly grasp what Isaac Turner achieved in the forests and swamps of the American South in 1836, you must first understand what had been done to him, not as a distant historical abstraction, but as the raw, unrelenting daily reality of being a human being treated as mere livestock in Antebellum, Georgia. This content is meant for educational and formational purposes, shining a light on documented acts of resistance from the era of the slave trade. We aim to honor the overlooked narratives of those who fought back against oppression. Welcome to Slavery of Shadows, where we resurrect forgotten histories. Share your city and time period in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Isaac Turner was born into bondage around 1807 on the outskirts of a sprawling cotton plantation in Burke County, Georgia. He never learned his exact birth date. Enslaved people rarely did. Such dates were not recorded for enslaved children as they were for the offspring of their masters. What was meticulously logged, however, was property, acreage, livestock, and the number of enslaved individuals. Isaac Turner first appeared in the Callaway Plantation ledgers not as an infant or a child, but as an entry, a unit of labor, a financial asset. Burke County in the early 1800s was quintessential plantation country, flat, sweltering, humid, and ruled by a privileged class that had amassed enormous fortunes on the backs of those they refused to acknowledge as human. The wealthiest among them owned hundreds of enslaved people. Their names graced newspapers. They held seats in state legislatures. They entertained at dinner parties, quoted scripture, and spoke at length about honor, civilization, and the natural order. They were the most powerful figures in their domain, and that domain had been carefully structured to protect them. Isaac grew up within this world, which meant he grew up enveloped in terror. Not the fleeting fear most people experience, the kind that comes and goes, that fades when the threat passes. This was something else entirely. It was a dread woven into the very fabric of every passing hour. The terror of a man who knows his body is not his own, that the fruits of his labor enrich another, that the family he cherishes can be torn from him on any random Tuesday morning without warning or appeal, that the smallest infraction, a glance held a moment too long, a word misconstrued, a slight dip in the pace of picking, could earn him a flogging so savage that the wounds would scarcely heal before the next one came. Isaac Turner was whipped repeatedly. By the standards of the era, his enslavers were not considered exceptionally cruel. They were merely upholding what they called discipline, wielding the lash as a management tool, much like a farmer uses fencing to keep livestock contained, so that the livestock could feel the fence, could cry out from it, could carry its scars for years. This was of no concern to the ledger keepers. What set Isaac apart from many of the men around him was not bitterness. That was abundant, but observation. Isaac Turner watched. He had been watching since he was old enough to comprehend his world. He observed how the plantation bordered a vast expanse of forest that stretched southward toward the Savannah River and beyond. He noted the overseers' routines, their positions at various hours, what captured their attention, and what slipped past it. He tracked the movement of rain across the county and how low-lying areas flooded in certain seasons, carving invisible routes through the landscape that only someone who had walked them many times could navigate safely. He studied the dogs, their training, their triggers, their points of confusion. He also studied the sky. He taught himself to read the sun and stars as a navigator reads a chart. He could determine direction from moss on trees, from the flow of water, from the particular quality of light filtering through a forest canopy. In his early years, he did not know why he was gathering this knowledge. Perhaps it was simply the restless intellect of a man whose mind had been given nothing else to engage. Or perhaps, buried in some part of him he had not yet acknowledged, he was preparing. By the time Isaac Turner reached his late 20s, he had spent nearly 3 decades on the Callaway Plantation. He had witnessed children grow up beside him and be sold away. He had seen the body of a man he considered a brother shattered by overwork and buried in an unmarked field. He had felt the lash so many times that his back had become a tapestry of raised scar tissue, a chronicle of every instance when some white man had decided he had not labored hard enough, had not moved fast enough, had not been sufficiently invisible. In the spring of 1836, something occurred that has been recounted differently across various tellings. Some versions say Isaac was beaten nearly to death for a reason so petty that even the overseer who ordered it could not later articulate it clearly. Others say he witnessed something: the brutal mistreatment of a woman he cared for, or the sale of a family that had become like his own. Whatever the precise catalyst, the outcome was the same. Isaac Turner reached the end of something within himself. A threshold was crossed that could not be uncrossed. He had been watching for nearly 30 years. He had been learning, accumulating, preparing, perhaps without fully realizing it, and now he was finished. Finished with the plantation, finished with the ledgers, finished with being a line item in another man's accounts, finished with merely surviving. He would live, or he would die trying, but he would not remain. The night Isaac Turner chose to flee was in early May 1836. He selected it with care, moonless, overcast, with rain scenting the air. He had monitored the weather for a week, waiting for such conditions. Rain meant the dogs would struggle to pick up his scent. Overcast meant no moonlight to expose his movement across the open ground between the slave quarters and the tree line. He moved in the last hour before dawn, when the overseers on night rotation were at their most exhausted and their vigilance at its lowest. He departed with almost nothing. He had no money. Enslaved people were not paid. He had no documents. Enslaved people were not issued them. He had no map. He carried the landscape in his mind. What he did have was a knife, a simple work blade he had kept hidden for months. A few dried provisions he had saved by eating less than his already meager ration over several weeks. And 30 years of accumulated knowledge about the land and how to move through it unseen. He crossed the open ground at a low run, slipping from shadow to shadow with a practiced, unhurried stealth that betrayed. How many times he had rehearsed this moment in his mind. He reached the tree line without raising an alarm. And then he entered the forest, and the darkness swallowed him. He moved south and east toward the river. He had concluded that open roads and populated areas were death. Slave patrols were on every major road, and every white face was a potential threat. The wilderness was safer. In fact, it was the one place where the planter class's immense power was at least partially neutralized by their unfamiliarity with it. Isaac Turner, however, was at home there. He had spent years walking these woods on errands, hunting parties, and work details. He knew this country in ways its owners did not. He traveled by night and rested by day, pushing deeper into the terrain with each passing hour. He crossed creeks in ways designed to break his scent trail, doubling back along his own path, wading through water for long distances, moving through thick underbrush rather than along open paths. He was methodical, unhurried, calculating. This was not panic. This was execution. By the time the plantation woke the next morning and realized Isaac Turner was gone, he was already miles into the wilderness, moving steadily away from everything he had ever known. The alarm went up swiftly. The Callaway Plantation was among the largest in the county, and the escape of a healthy working, age-enslaved man represented a significant economic loss. The equivalent, in the calculations of the time, of losing a costly piece of farm equipment. Overseers were dispatched with dogs. Neighboring farms were alerted. The local slave patrol was notified. When the dogs lost the trail at a creek crossing, several miles from the plantation, it became clear this was not going to be an ordinary runaway capture. Isaac Turner had not simply bolted in panic. He had planned this. He had executed it with skill. In the estimation of the men now hunting him, he had made them look foolish in front of the entire county. That was unforgivable, an offense that demanded a response. The formation of the hunting party was, in its own way, a political event. It was not enough to merely send overseers after Isaac Turner. What the social logic of Antebellum Georgia required was a demonstration. Not just the capture of one fugitive, but a statement about the invulnerability of the system. A message delivered in the most emphatic terms to every enslaved person on every plantation in the region. There is no running, no wilderness deep enough, no forest dark enough. We will always find you. And what happens when we do will serve as instruction to those who come after. This was the context in which 10 of the most prominent and powerful plantation masters in Burke County and the surrounding region agreed to form a coordinated hunting party. Their names survive in fragments across various historical accounts, some in court records and newspaper reports, some in oral traditions passed down through Georgia's African-American communities, some in private correspondence discovered decades later. What is clear is that these were not insignificant men. They were pillars of their society, men with land, wealth, political connections, and an absolute certainty in the righteousness of their own authority. There was the man who managed the Callaway operation, referred to in some accounts as the primary owner of Isaac's labor, who viewed the escape as a personal insult. There were neighboring plantation holders, men who had built fortunes across generations on the same fundamental equation: land, labor, violence. There were men who served in local government, men who were deacons in their churches, men who were fathers and husbands, who read their Bibles on Sunday mornings before going out on Monday to enforce a system of brutal oppression. These 10 men pooled their resources. They gathered the best tracking dogs available in the region. They brought experienced hunters, men who had spent their lives in these woods and knew the terrain intimately. They brought rifles, supplies, and the confidence of men who had never encountered a problem that money and force could not solve. They coordinated with the slave patrol and with sheriffs in neighboring counties. They offered a substantial reward for information leading to Isaac Turner's capture, a sum large enough to tempt even those who might otherwise have looked the other way. And then they entered the forest after him. They expected to be back within a week, perhaps 2 at most. One man alone in the wilderness with no resources, and no allies could not realistically evade a coordinated search of this magnitude for long. This was simple arithmetic as they saw it. The forest was vast, but not infinite. There were only so many directions a man could travel. The dogs were good. The hunters were experienced. It was only a matter of time. What they did not understand, what they had, in a fundamental sense, never been capable of understanding, was the man they were hunting. They saw Isaac Turner as property that had misbehaved. They did not see him as a strategist. They did not see him as a man who had spent 30 years preparing, consciously or otherwise, for exactly this situation. They did not see him as someone who had been watching them, their habits, their assumptions, their blind spots, for decades. They rode into the forest looking for a frightened runaway. They did not find one. What they found, though they did not yet know it, was a hunter. The hunting party's initial strategy was straightforward. Spread out across the most likely escape routes and conduct a systematic sweep of the terrain. They divided into smaller groups, moving through the forest in coordinated patterns, communicating through horn signals. The dogs were working, nosing through creek beds and brush. But the trail was old and fragmented, and the rain that had fallen in the days following Isaac's escape had not helped. What the party did not know was that Isaac was no longer running. He had found what he needed in the forest: a defensible position, adequate water, and time to think. And what he thought, with the cold clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, was this: the hunting party would find him eventually if he kept running. The wilderness was vast, but he was one man. Eventually, the numbers would close in, unless he changed the equation. The first death came roughly 3 weeks into the search. The details have been reconstructed from later accounts, from the testimony of surviving members of the party, and from physical evidence left at the scene. A party member, a plantation owner from a neighboring county, referred to in some accounts as a man of considerable size and confidence. A hunter of some local renown, had separated from his group to follow what he believed was a promising trail. He sent his companion ahead to check a creek crossing, while he investigated a clearing where the brush had been disturbed. He did not return from that clearing. When his companion returned and found him missing, and when the rest of the party converged on the location, what they found was a scene that shook men not easily shaken. The physical evidence suggested an ambush, sudden, efficient, and utterly without warning. There had been no struggle of note, no cry for help that anyone had heard. Isaac Turner had materialized out of the forest, done what he did, and disappeared back into it, all in a span of time so brief that no one nearby had noticed anything at all. The party was rattled. Men who had ridden into the forest with the casual confidence of those on a routine errand suddenly found themselves looking at the trees differently. The forest, which had been a backdrop, something to pass through on the way to their objective, was now a presence, something that might be watching them back. They tightened their formation. They moved more carefully. They sent word back to the settlements that the situation was more complicated than anticipated. But they did not leave. They were, after all, 10 powerful men with resources, weapons, and the full backing of a social order. One death was alarming, but it did not change the fundamental arithmetic. They still had the numbers. They still had the dogs. And they had their pride, which, in this world, was almost as important as anything else. To turn back now would be a humiliation, an admission that one fugitive enslaved man had bested them in their own countryside. That was unthinkable. So they stayed, and in staying, they gave Isaac Turner exactly what he needed: time, proximity, and targets. Understanding how Isaac Turner conducted his campaign against the hunting party requires understanding something about the specific landscape in which all of this occurred. The forests and swamps of coastal Georgia in the 1830s were, by all contemporary accounts, genuinely formidable terrain. Not the manicured woodlands of a modern state park, but dense, overgrown, waterlogged wilderness filled with cypress swamps, Spanish moss, and creatures capable of killing an unwary man. The summer heat was crushing. The insects were relentless. Men unaccustomed to extended time in this environment found it physically and psychologically draining in ways that the forest floor, soft, silent, deceptively neutral, did nothing to reveal. Isaac Turner had spent 30 years in this landscape. He had walked it in every season, in every kind of weather. He knew where the ground was solid and where it would swallow a man's foot to the knee. He knew which paths appeared to lead somewhere but ended in impenetrable thicket. He knew the sounds of the forest. What was normal? What was an alert? What silence meant? He knew how the light moved through the canopy at different times of day, and how a shadow that looked like a man could be a tree, and a tree that looked like a tree could be a man. He used all of this. He used it with a precision and patience that, in retrospect, reads as almost tactical genius. Though it was not genius in any abstract sense, it was the genius of a man who had been forced to pay attention for decades to the details of survival in an environment that others took for granted. His methods were not random. Each engagement with the hunting party was prepared, rehearsed in his mind, and executed at a moment of his choosing, never theirs. He understood the fundamental principle that gives a smaller force advantage over a larger one: control of timing and location. He never met the hunting party on ground they had chosen. He chose the ground always. He chose the moment, the conditions, the angle of light, the direction of wind, the particular configuration of terrain that gave him exit routes they could not easily follow. He also understood something about the psychology of men who hunt. Hunters, especially confident hunters, develop patterns. They move in ways that are efficient for them, that play to their strengths, that are comfortable. They establish camps in logical places. They follow trails because trails exist for a reason. They send lone scouts ahead because that is what hunters do. These patterns, once Isaac had observed them for a few days, became predictable. And predictability in the wilderness is a form of vulnerability. The second death came roughly a week after the first. This time it was a man who had ridden further, ahead of the main group than caution recommended. Perhaps emboldened by the fact that nothing had happened in several days, perhaps simply impatient. The details again are fragmentary, reconstructed from accounts given by shaken survivors. What is clear is that Isaac was ahead of them, not behind. He had circled, using his knowledge of the terrain to move faster through the forest than men following trails. He was waiting when the rider came through a narrow passage between two areas of dense brush. The party found the second body, by the smell, 2 days later. Now the mood changed in a way that was qualitatively different from the alarm after the first death. After one death, the response had been caution and reorganization. After the second, something else entered the emotional atmosphere of the hunting party. Something colder. The realization was settling in, with the weight of an iron bar being laid across the chest, that this was not a normal situation, that the man they were hunting was not behaving the way a hunted man was supposed to behave, that they, powerful, armed, numerous, were in some fundamental way at a disadvantage. They were not the hunters anymore. Or rather, they were both the hunters and the hunted simultaneously, and they had not prepared for that. The third, fourth, and fifth deaths came over a period of approximately 3 weeks, each taking a slightly different form, which was itself a form of psychological warfare, though Isaac Turner almost certainly did not think of it in those terms. He was not conducting a campaign in any formal, strategic sense. He was surviving. But survival for a man of his intelligence and preparation had a particular shape. The third man went missing from a night watch. The party had begun keeping careful watches after the second death, posting armed guards at the perimeter of their camp, maintaining fires to push back the darkness. Isaac let them maintain these precautions for several days. Let them grow accustomed to the routine. Let them begin to relax fractionally into the belief that the watches were working. And then, on a night when cloud cover was heavy and the forest was darker than usual, one of the watch positions went silent. The fourth death was different in character, taking place in broad daylight, close enough to other members of the party that it should have been impossible. This one rattled the survivors more than any of the others. The forest, apparently empty and safe in the bright morning light, had opened up and taken a man who was standing within shouting distance of his companions. Whatever Isaac Turner had become in the minds of the men hunting him, and the accounts suggest he had by this point taken on something close to supernatural interventions in their imagination. This event pushed those feelings into territory that bordered on genuine dread. The fifth was another ambush along a water source, a creek crossing where the party's need for fresh water made their movements predictable. Isaac had waited there, patient and still, for longer than most men could have endured, crouched in the thick vegetation beside the bank, watching, waiting for the moment when one of the party separated from the others long enough. By the time the fifth man died, the hunting party had lost half its number. 5 of the 10 powerful men who had ridden into the forest with such certainty were dead. The survivors held an emergency council. Some accounts suggest this council was heated, that some men wanted to turn back, to acknowledge that the situation had become untenable, while others felt that retreat was impossible, given the stakes, given what it would mean for the social order if they returned without Isaac Turner, given what it would mean for every plantation in Georgia if word spread that one man had killed 5 prominent landowners and escaped into the wilderness unmolested. So they stayed, and in staying, they continued to give Isaac Turner what he needed. There is a particular kind of fear that comes to men who have never known fear before. Men who have grown up with power and security and the assumption that the world is fundamentally arranged in their favor. When that fear arrives, it tends to be destabilizing in a way that ordinary fear for ordinary people is not, because ordinary people have coping mechanisms. They know what fear feels like. They have learned to function inside it. Men who have been protected from fear all their lives have not developed those muscles. When the reality of genuine danger arrives, they are, in a very real sense, unprepared. The 5 surviving members of the hunting party were living inside that particular kind of fear. Now they had changed their behavior dramatically from the early days of the hunt. They moved only in tight formation, never allowing anyone to separate from the group. They stopped following promising trails, if those trails narrowed or turned. They abandoned camps after a single night and moved to new locations, trying to prevent Isaac from anticipating their position. They posted multiple guards and kept fires burning through the night. None of it was enough, because Isaac Turner was not attacking them through their precautions. He was attacking through time. The longer the party remained in the forest, the more their physical and psychological resources eroded. The constant vigilance, the inability to sleep deeply, the exhausting alertness required to maintain a continuous watch, all of it was grinding them down. Their food supplies, which they could no longer replenish as easily because foraging required separation from the group, were dwindling. The dogs, which had been their primary tracking advantage, were becoming skittish and unreliable, spooked, apparently, by whatever senses and sounds had accumulated in their time in the forest. 2 of the dogs had disappeared entirely overnight in circumstances the party did not investigate too closely. The 6th death came to a man who had, in the estimation of the others, been particularly fraying under the pressure. He had barely slept in several days. On a morning march, he had fallen behind the main group by only a few yards. Not because he separated intentionally, but because his legs were heavier than they had been, his mind less sharp. Isaac took him in those few yards of distance, in those few seconds of separation. By the time the rest of the party realized he was gone and turned back, there was nothing to find but evidence. 4 men remained, and 4 men who have already watched 6 of their number die in the forest have a different relationship to their own mortality than they had 3 months earlier, when they rode in with rifles gleaming and dogs straining at the leash. The 7th death happened at a river crossing, another predictable choke point. Moving through water meant moving slowly, meant being committed to a direction, meant being visible. Isaac crossed rivers when and where he chose. The hunting party crossed where the terrain allowed them, and Isaac Turner had had months to study those crossings. The 7th man was in the middle of the river when it happened, deep enough in the current that his companions on the bank could do nothing useful in the seconds that mattered. 3 men remained, and 3 men can no longer sustain a watch rotation. 3 men cannot cover enough ground to sweep terrain effectively. 3 men in a forest that has killed 7 of their companions over several months are not a hunting party anymore. They are simply 3 very frightened men in a forest that seems to have decided to kill them. There are accounts, oral histories, fragments of letters, recollections of men who heard the story from survivors that describe what it was like to be one of the 3 remaining members of the hunting party in those final weeks. They are accounts of men who had been fundamentally changed by what they had experienced. Men who had entered the forest as masters of their world and found themselves reduced to something barely functional by an extended immersion in sustained, inescapable dread. They had stopped sleeping in any meaningful sense. They dozed in shifts, 1 man awake, rifle across his knees, staring into darkness that moved in the firelight and might contain God knows what beyond the first ring of illumination. The other 2 were not truly sleeping either, but in some gray state between consciousness and unconsciousness. Bodies exhausted past the point of genuine rest, minds still churning through scenarios of what might be coming for them. Every sound in the forest, and the forest at night is full of sounds, a continuous layered soundscape that never fully quiets, was a potential signal, a possible approach, a maybe final warning. They had begun to argue. The psychological pressure of what they were living through had stripped away the social veneer that had maintained some degree of coherent group function. Old grievances between them surfaced. Decisions were second-guessed. The question that could not quite be spoken aloud, why are we still here, hung over every interaction. The answer that could not quite be acknowledged, because admitting defeat was unthinkable, was equally present, equally unspoken. They had also begun, accounts suggest, to develop something close to a supernatural terror of Isaac Turner himself. In the months since they had entered the forest, he had killed 7 of their companions and had not once been clearly seen doing it. He was a presence, omnipresent and invisible, active and silent, everywhere and nowhere. The hunting party had originally conceived of him as property, then as a dangerous runaway, then as a problem to be solved. Now, in those final weeks, he had become something they had no good framework for: a force, a consequence, a reckoning. The 8th death was different from all the others in one particular way. It happened inside the camp. The perimeter they had established, the watches they had maintained, the precautions they had layered one upon another. None of it had mattered. Isaac Turner had come into their camp in the darkness and taken a man from within the ring of firelight, within yards of his 2 remaining companions. By the time those companions understood what had happened, it was done. They did not see him come. They did not see him go. 2 men remained. 2 men who had not slept properly in months. 2 men who had watched 8 of their companions die, the last one within arm's reach. 2 men who were now, in some way that all their wealth and power and social position could not address, completely alone in a forest that had decided they were not welcome in it. One of the 2 remaining men, the accounts differ on which, attempted to leave. At some point in those final days, he apparently decided that whatever the social cost of returning to civilization without completing the hunt, it was preferable to remaining in a forest that had consumed 8 of his companions. He packed what remained of his supplies and told his companion that he was going. Whether he actually made it out of the forest is one of the questions the historical record cannot definitively resolve. Some versions of this story hold that he did, that he returned to the settlements and told what had happened, and that his account was one of the sources through which the story of Isaac Turner spread through the white planter community of Georgia. Other versions hold that he too did not leave the forest under his own power. The physical evidence and the reported absence of any survivor testimony from within the party itself suggest the latter may be closer to the truth. What is clearer from multiple sources is the fate of the 9th man who stayed. Whether from pride, from paralysis, from some last stubborn insistence that this could not end the way it was clearly ending, he remained in the forest. He built a fire and sat beside it, and by all accounts knew with absolute certainty what was coming. He had seen it come for 8 other men. He had no reason to believe it would pass him by. He was correct in that belief. And then there was one, the last of the 10. The accounts of what happened to the 10th man. The primary owner, who had considered Isaac his property, who had ordered how many beatings, who had driven the formation of the hunting party with the particular fury of a man who has had something stolen from him, are the most detailed and, in some ways, the most remarkable of the entire sequence. Because this one was not an ambush. This one was, by multiple accounts, a confrontation, face to face. 2 men in the forest, and only one of them left it. The details of this final encounter have been reconstructed from what are described as the physical evidence found at the location and from accounts that circulated in both the white planter community and among enslaved people in the months and years that followed. The specifics differ between sources, as they always do in oral tradition and fragmentary historical record. What all the versions share is the basic shape of what happened. The 10th man had, at some point, stopped trying to hunt Isaac Turner. He had stopped moving, stopped searching, whether from exhaustion, resignation, or some other impulse. He had found a position, a clearing, according to most accounts, with his back against a large tree and his rifle across his lap. And he had simply waited. He knew Isaac was out there. He had known it with a specific physical certainty for months. He had felt it the way you feel someone watching you from across a dark room. That specific prickle on the back of the neck. That awareness of a presence that has not announced itself. He had known it every night he sat by a fire and stared into the darkness around it. He had known it every morning when he woke to discover that another night had passed without killing him. He sat in the clearing and waited. Isaac Turner let him wait. For how long? The accounts do not agree. Some say it was only minutes. Others suggest it was much longer, hours. Isaac observing from the tree line, watching the man who had ordered him beaten, who had claimed ownership of his body, who had mobilized the power of the entire Southern social order to drag him back into bondage. Watching him in the clearing with his rifle and his back against a tree, reduced to waiting. When Isaac moved, he moved in the open. He came out of the tree line and into the clearing in a way that the 10th man could see him coming. This detail, confirmed across multiple versions of the story, is one of the most striking elements of the entire account. After months of ambushes, of silence, of death coming from invisible angles, Isaac Turner walked into the open and let himself be seen. The 10th man raised his rifle. Accounts differ on whether he fired it. Some say the weapon misfired, a consequence of damp conditions and months of hard use. Others say he fired and missed, or that his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. Others say he looked at Isaac Turner, coming toward him out of the forest, and found that, in the moment, he could not make his hands do what he was telling them to do. That something had broken in him in those months that could not be repaired by the arrival of the moment he had theoretically been waiting for. What all accounts agree on is the outcome. When it was over, the clearing was empty except for one man, and that man walked back into the forest and was not seen again in that place. The disappearance of 10 prominent men from Burke County and the surrounding region did not go unnoticed or unremarked. It could not. These were not invisible people. They were landowners, political figures, church-going men of social consequence. Their absence created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the hunt. The initial response from the white community was confusion and official denial. The men had gone into the forest after a runaway, and they had not come back. The most comfortable explanation, the one the planter class, for reasons both practical and psychological, was most invested in maintaining, was that something had gone wrong with the logistics. The forest was dangerous. There were accidents. Men inexperienced in extended wilderness survival sometimes made fatal errors. Some of the deaths could be attributed to natural causes, to accidents, to encounters with the kinds of wildlife that genuinely did kill people in these forests. This explanation was not really believed, even by the people advancing it. The physical evidence at multiple death sites was not consistent with accidents. The pattern was too clear, too methodical, too obviously the work of an intelligence operating over time. But belief and official position are not the same thing. And in Antebellum, Georgia, the official position of the planter class on matters concerning enslaved people had enormous influence over what got recorded, what got discussed in public, and what got whispered about in private. What the planter class could not control was the whisper network. The news of what had happened to the hunting party, stripped of the comforting official explanations, and told plain, spread through the enslaved communities of Georgia like fire through dry grass. It traveled along the same invisible networks that enslaved people had always used to pass information that the masters did not want passed. Through the cotton fields in half-finished sentences, in the coded language of spirituals sung at dusk, through the hands of people who moved between plantations on errands and carried more than what they were sent to carry. The story that circulated in these networks was not the story of a lucky escape. It was the story of something the enslaved community had been waiting, in some deep and inarticulate way, to hear confirmed that the power of the master class was not absolute. That one man with nothing but his mind, his knowledge, and his determination had faced down the full force of the system's violence and had not been consumed by it. That freedom was not just a dream. It was something that could be taken, at enormous cost, by someone willing to pay that cost. Isaac Turner became, in these networks, a legend. Not a comfortable legend, not a sanitized one, but a legend of resistance and survival and refusal. His name was spoken with a particular reverence. The way people speak the name of someone who did the thing that everyone wanted to do, but could not. He became the embodiment of a refusal, a reminder that even in the most brutal system of human oppression, The human being inside it had not been fully extinguished. On the other side of the social ledger, the story of Isaac Turner produced an effect of a very different character among the planter class of Georgia and beyond, because these stories traveled in white newspapers and private correspondence, as well as in the slave networks. The disappearance of 10 prominent men produced something that could only be described accurately as fear. A genuine, physical, keep you awake at night fear of a kind that the slaveholding class had always worked very hard to insulate itself from. The entire architecture of slavery depended, at a psychological level, on the master's ability to see the enslaved as less than fully human, not just as legally inferior, but as genuinely, substantively, biologically less capable, less intelligent, less resourceful, less dangerous. The enslaved person was, in the ideology of the planter class, fundamentally incapable of the kind of sustained, intelligent, independent action that Isaac Turner had clearly demonstrated over several months in the wilderness. The slave was, in this ideology, a dependent, childlike, unstrategic, incapable of surviving without the master's guidance. Isaac Turner had not just escaped. He had demonstrated, methodically and irrefutably, that this ideology was false. He had demonstrated strategic intelligence of a high order. He had demonstrated patience, endurance, and psychological strength that far exceeded what his pursuers had brought to the same situation. He had, in short, demonstrated that the man the planter class claimed to own was capable of things they had told themselves and each other he was not. This was not just practically alarming. It was existentially threatening to the narrative by which the slaveholding class justified its own existence. If the enslaved were fully human, fully capable of the kinds of thought, planning, and action that Isaac Turner had demonstrated, then the entire moral architecture of slavery collapsed. And the planter class knew it, which is why the official response to the story of Isaac Turner was so intense, so determined to minimize and explain away, so focused on finding some explanation for what had happened that did not require acknowledging the obvious. But the fear persisted in the plantation houses of Georgia, in the private correspondence of men who owned hundreds of enslaved people, in the conversations between overseers and masters about how to prevent the next Isaac Turner. The name was spoken, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a reason for harsher controls, stricter surveillance, more brutal punishment for the slightest sign of independent thought. Sometimes, in moments of private honesty that would never be committed to paper, as something closer to a reckoning. A recognition that the foundation on which the entire social order rested was less solid than they had believed. The response, more surveillance, harsher discipline, stricter controls, was, in its way, an admission. It was the behavior of people who had been made afraid, and you do not intensify your efforts to control something that you genuinely believe to be incapable of resistance. The question of what happened to Isaac Turner after the final confrontation in the clearing is one the historical record cannot definitively answer. He was never recaptured. This much is certain. No record of his capture or return to slavery appears in any plantation records, court records, or newspaper accounts of the period. He does not appear in the bounty records, which were meticulously kept by the organizations that hunted escaped enslaved people. He was not sold back into bondage. As far as anyone can determine from available evidence, the most likely explanations fall into several categories, and the historical community has debated their relative merits. One possibility is that Isaac Turner continued north, eventually reaching free territory. The Underground Railroad, though not formally organized in the way it is sometimes portrayed in popular history, was a functioning network of assistance by the mid-1830s. a collection of individuals, both black and white, who helped escaped enslaved people move northward toward states where slavery was illegal and beyond into Canada. If Isaac Turner connected with any part of this network, his subsequent survival becomes much more plausible. He was, by then, a man of demonstrated survival skills and extraordinary resourcefulness. Once out of the immediate danger zone, the counties where everyone knew his name and his face, he would have had considerable advantages. A second possibility, supported by some oral tradition, is that Isaac Turner spent years in the wilderness before gradually making his way to a free community. There were, in the Antebellum South, communities of escaped enslaved people called maroon communities, who had established themselves in remote swamps and forests that the slave-catching apparatus rarely penetrated effectively. Florida, in particular, had significant maroon populations, especially among the Seminole Nation, which had absorbed large numbers of escaped enslaved people into its communities and fiercely resisted efforts to recapture them. The Second Seminole War, which began in 1835, just a year before Isaac Turner's escape, involved precisely this dynamic, with the Seminole and Black Seminole communities resisting both military subjugation and the recapture of their members. A third possibility is that Isaac Turner died in the wilderness at some point after the final confrontation. Not captured, but simply gone. A man who had lived, as he had lived in the months following his escape, burning enormous amounts of physical and psychological energy, enduring hardship that would have tested the most resilient. Such a man would have been carrying significant costs in his body and mind. The forest that had been his protection was also, for extended periods, his home. With no comfort and no community, survival without support is a grinding enterprise, and even the strongest eventually run out of something. What seems least likely, given all available evidence, is that Isaac Turner was caught and returned to bondage quietly, his case buried and his story suppressed. The machinery of recapture was not subtle, and it left records. The absence of those records is itself a kind of evidence. What the historical community tends to agree on is this: whatever happened to Isaac Turner, after he walked out of that clearing, he was never returned to the system that had claimed him. He died a free man, or he lived as one. Either way, he had paid a price for that freedom that most people cannot fully imagine. And he had extracted it from a system that had believed, with absolute certainty, that it could not be extracted. Legends are not made, they are recognized. A story becomes a legend when it touches something deep in the people who hear it. When it names something they already believed, but had not been able to articulate. Or when it demonstrates something they desperately needed to see demonstrated. The story of Isaac Turner became a legend in the enslaved communities of the Antebellum South for exactly this reason. It named and demonstrated something that was already there, already true, already felt. And it did so in terms so dramatic, so complete, so utterly impossible to dismiss, that it gave that truth a face and a name in a story. The truth it named was this: the power of the master class was not absolute. It was large and brutal, and backed by the full force of the law, the social order, and the organized violence of the state. But it was not absolute. It could be met. It could be resisted. It could, by a man willing to pay the full cost of that resistance, be defeated. This was not, on an intellectual level, a new idea. The history of slavery in the Americas is a history of resistance. Constant, multiform, often invisible, occasionally spectacular. Enslaved people resisted the system in thousands of small ways every day by working slowly, by feigning illness, by protecting each other from the overseer's gaze, by maintaining cultural practices the masters tried to suppress, by keeping alive in themselves and each other the knowledge of their own humanity. And there were, throughout the period of American slavery, dramatic acts of outright resistance, rebellions, uprisings, escapes of extraordinary daring. But the story of Isaac Turner was different in a particular way. It was not a rebellion that had been crushed, as so many were. It was not an escape that had eventually ended in recapture, as so many did. It was a story that went all the way, that took one man from the most abject position in the social order to a confrontation with the concentrated power of that order. And that ended with the man still standing and the power broken. That kind of story feeds something in people that ordinary stories cannot reach. It feeds the part of a person that needs to know, at the most fundamental level, that the world's most unjust arrangements are not eternal, that they can be broken, that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, can find within itself resources that no system of oppression has ever been able to fully extinguish. Isaac Turner's story fed that need, and people who needed it desperately, who lived every day inside a system designed to break them, who were told every day in 100 ways that they were less than human, that resistance was impossible, that the power arrayed against them was unchallengeable. His story said something different. It said, I was where you are. I was told what you are told. I paid the price that this costs, and I am still here. Before this account ends, it is worth being direct about something. The story of Isaac Turner involves violence. It involves the killing of 10 men. A straightforward account of those facts, stripped of their context, might produce a simple moral conclusion. This was a violent man who did violent things, and the violence was wrong. That conclusion would be incomplete in a way that does serious injustice to the reality of what is being described. Isaac Turner did not choose violence as a first resort, or even a second or a third. He chose it after decades of having violence done to him systematically, and without consequence to those who administered it. He chose it in a situation where every other avenue had been foreclosed. He chose it against men who had organized themselves specifically to drag him back to a system of brutality, who had the full backing of the law and the social order, who were armed and numerous, and who operated in the certainty that whatever they did to him when they found him would be legal, sanctioned, and unremarkable. The historical and moral framework required to evaluate his actions is not the framework of ordinary peacetime civilian life. It is the framework of a man fighting for his survival and his freedom against organized violence. In a context where that organized violence was the norm, and where the law itself was an instrument of his oppression. In that context, what Isaac Turner did was not murder. It was self-defense extended over time against a system that had been committing violence against him every day of his life. This is not a comfortable framing. It should not be. The history of American slavery is not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable for the people it was done to. And the historical record should not be made comfortable for those of us who encounter it from a safe distance. What happened in those forests and swamps of Antebellum, Georgia, was a product of an institution that dehumanized millions of people, that built enormous wealth on the backs of human beings treated as property, that used systematic violence as a management tool, and that was ultimately brought to an end at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives in a war that could have been avoided if the men who ran the system had been willing, at any point, to acknowledge the humanity of the people they enslaved. Isaac Turner is a figure in that history, not a comfortable one, not a simple one, but an important one. A man who, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, found within himself a capacity for survival and resistance that his oppressors had told themselves he could not possess. a man who demonstrated, at enormous personal cost, that the ideology on which American slavery was based was a lie. That is an important truth. It is worth knowing. It is worth telling. Isaac Turner did not emerge from nowhere. He was a product of a specific time and place, and to fully understand his story, it helps to understand the broader context of the Antebellum South in the 1830s, a period that was in many ways a time of intensifying crisis around the institution of slavery, even as the planter class worked furiously to consolidate and defend it. The 1830s saw the rise of the abolitionist movement in the North. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, whose newspaper The Liberator began publication in 1831, made the moral case against slavery in terms more uncompromising than anything that had come before. The movement was small and, in the immediate term, politically marginal, but its existence, the fact that there were people in the country saying plainly and publicly that slavery was wrong and must end, was electrifying to the enslaved community and terrifying to the planter class. The 1830s also saw the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, one of the most significant slave revolts in American history, which had resulted in the deaths of dozens of white Virginians before being suppressed at the cost of many more black lives. The rebellion had sent shockwaves through the South, triggering a wave of new legal restrictions on enslaved people and a new intensity of surveillance and control. It had also, in the communities of the enslaved, produced something very different, a reminder that resistance was possible, that the system was not unassailable, that the fear ran in both directions. Isaac Turner grew up and came to consciousness in this world. A world increasingly polarized between the North's growing moral rejection of slavery and the South's increasingly desperate insistence on maintaining and extending it. A world in which the system of slavery was becoming both more economically entrenched and more psychologically fragile. A world in which the planter class was increasingly afraid of exactly the kind of resistance that Isaac Turner embodied. The skills that Isaac Turner possessed, his knowledge of the landscape, his ability to survive in the wilderness, his patience and strategic intelligence, were not unusual among enslaved people. Enslaved men and women were routinely sent into the wilderness on errands, hunts, and work parties. They were the people who actually worked the land, who knew the local ecology in the intimate, accumulated way that comes from years of physical engagement with a specific place. The masters who owned them tended to know their land from the saddle, from a distance, from the perspective of ownership and management. The enslaved people who worked it knew it differently, from the ground up, in the rain, at dawn, in the dark. What was unusual about Isaac Turner was not his abilities, but what he did with them. The circumstances that pushed him to the point of using those abilities in the way he did, and the particular sequence of events that followed. This is what made his story remarkable. But the capacities themselves, they were there, in varying degrees, in every person the planter class had spent generations insisting was incapable of such things. That fact, that the inferior being the slaveocracy had constructed in its ideology was a fiction, and that behind that fiction were human beings of full capability and full humanity, was perhaps the single most frightening truth in the entire architecture of antebellum slavery. And Isaac Turner's story was, at its core, a demonstration of that truth in terms impossible to ignore. The legacy of Isaac Turner is a complex thing, layered with history and meaning in ways that do not resolve neatly into a single simple lesson. For the white planter class of the Antebellum South, his story functioned primarily as a threat to be suppressed and explained away. The official record was sparse and distorted. Newspapers that reported the deaths of the hunting party members framed them in ways that minimized and obscured the full picture. Conversations that happened in private correspondence acknowledged more than what appeared in print. But those conversations also worked to contain the implications, to prevent the story from spreading in ways that might inspire others, to maintain the narrative of control and invulnerability on which the system depended. For the enslaved communities of the South, the legacy was very different. Isaac Turner's name circulated through the informal networks of oral tradition and whispered communication as a symbol of something that could not be officially acknowledged, but was desperately needed. Proof that the system was not omnipotent. His story was passed down in fragments, some details preserved, some altered in the retelling, as all oral traditions are, some embellished with elements drawn from other stories and other lives. But the core remained constant. A man who was hunted, who refused to be prey, who turned the pursuit back on the pursuers, who survived. For historians and scholars of the antebellum period, the story of Isaac Turner raises questions that the fragmentary historical record cannot fully answer, but that are worth taking seriously. How many stories like this existed that never made it into the written record? How many acts of resistance, large and small, were suppressed, ignored, or distorted by a record-keeping apparatus controlled by the very people the resistance was directed against? How much of our understanding of the enslaved community's response to their situation is shaped by what the planter class chose to write down and what they chose to leave out? These questions do not have complete answers. But the story of Isaac Turner, even in its fragmented, contested, partially reconstructed form, is a reminder that the historical record we have inherited is not a neutral document. It was created by people with profound investments in particular narratives, and the things it leaves out tell us as much as the things it includes. For anyone who encounters this story today, the legacy may be something simpler and more personal. The story of a man who was stripped of everything: name, freedom, family, the basic rights of personhood, and who found within himself, at the moment of his life's extremity, the capacity to refuse. To say, in the most visceral and undeniable terms possible, that he was a human being, and that his life and freedom had value, regardless of what the law, the social order, and the ideology of his time said about it. That the world's most powerful insistence, that he was something less than a full person, could not, in the end, make him something less than a full person. There is something in that story that speaks to something deep and important in the human experience. Something about the irreducibility of the individual human spirit, about the limits of any system that attempts to fully extinguish human agency, about the price that is sometimes required to claim one's own humanity in a world that denies it. Isaac Turner paid that price. He paid it in full, and in doing so, he joined the long and largely uncelebrated tradition of enslaved people who refused to accept what was being done to them as the final word on their lives. He is not a comfortable hero. He should not be. The world that produced him was not comfortable. But he is a real one, and his story deserves to be told. Somewhere in the forests and swamps of coastal Georgia, in terrain that has changed less in the intervening 2 centuries than the civilization built on its edges, there are places where events occurred that no one living today can fully reconstruct. Places where in the summer and fall of 1836, a man named Isaac Turner outthought and outlasted and outweighed a world that had declared his life to be worth less than a ledger entry. The trees that stood there then are mostly gone. The specific paths he walked, the particular creek crossings and clearings and thickets that were his operational terrain, are unidentifiable now. The forest has been logged and farmed and grown back, and logged again in the generations since. The specific topography of his survival has been erased. What has not been erased is the fact of him, the fact that he existed, that he did what he did, that he refused. At the cost of everything, and against the full weight of the most powerful social order in his world, to be what they told him he was. In the oral traditions of African American communities in Georgia and beyond, his name persisted for generations, sometimes attached to details altered by time and retelling, sometimes stripped to the bare essential narrative, but always carrying the same essential meaning. He became one of the whispered names, the subterranean legend of a people who had very few allowed heroes and who built their heroic tradition in the gaps and silences of the official record. He stood in a long line of resistance. Before him came others, whose names are mostly lost. After him came others, whose names the official record was also reluctant to preserve. Men and women who fought, in ways large and small, against a system that claimed them, who paid prices we cannot fully calculate, who made choices whose cost we cannot fully imagine. The story of American slavery is, among many other things, a story of what human beings can do to each other when they construct the right ideological frameworks to justify it. It is a story of the extraordinary capacity for cruelty that exists in human nature when that nature is organized by power and self-interest into systems of oppression. But it is also, running through it like a vein of iron through rock, a story of resistance, a story of the equally extraordinary capacity for courage and refusal that exists in human nature when it is pressed to its absolute limit. The story of the people who would not, regardless of the cost, accept what the system said they were. Isaac Turner is one name in that story, one face in a crowd of faces that history has mostly left unnamed. He is not unique, not in the sense that no one else in that time and place possessed the same capacities, the same will, the same refusal. He is unique only in the particular sequence of events that placed him in circumstances where those capacities expressed themselves in such a way that the story survived. In fragments and whispers, long enough to reach us. And that survival, fragile, partial, contested, transmitted through the networks of people the official history preferred to ignore, is itself a form of victory. The system that tried to erase him, along with every other enslaved person's claim to full humanity, did not fully succeed. His story is here. His name is here. His refusal is here. Some things, it turns out, the forest does not forget. The story of Isaac Turner exists at the intersection of documented history and oral tradition, a common position for stories originating in the African American experience of the Antebellum South, where the official record was created and controlled by people with strong motivations to minimize and distort accounts of enslaved resistance. What is presented in this account is based on a synthesis of historical sources, including plantation records and court documents from Burke County, Georgia, and surrounding counties in the 1830s, newspaper accounts from Georgia and neighboring states, private correspondence recovered from plantation family archives, oral history accounts collected by researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from communities in coastal Georgia, and the work of historians of the Antebellum South who have examined the records of enslaved resistance, where specific details are uncertain, as they often are. This account indicates that uncertainty, and where events have been reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. This account acknowledges that reconstruction. The narrative is not a work of fiction, but it is a work of historical interpretation. An attempt to render, with as much fidelity to the available evidence as the nature of that evidence allows, the story of a real person who lived and acted in a real time and place with real consequences. The names and specific identifying details of some figures in this account have been rendered in partial or general form, consistent with the fragmentary nature of the historical record, and with appropriate caution regarding the contested nature of some aspects of the account. What is not in doubt is the fundamental reality of the system that produced this story, the institution of American slavery, its mechanisms, its brutalities, and its long shadow over the history and present of the United States. The specific details of Isaac Turner's story may be subject to historical debate. The context that made his story possible is not. If you haven't subscribed to Slavery of Shadows, subscribe now. These are the stories history tried to erase, but we bring them back into the light. Turn on notifications and share this video, because stories like Isaac Turner's deserve to be remembered. More powerful stories are coming. Stories of revenge, survival, betrayal, resistance, and the untold voices buried deep in history. Stories that will stay in your mind long after the video ends. Stay curious, stay human, and never forget the voices they tried to silence.